this idea that there may be a place for humans in the cosmos resonates most, I think, with the ecological ethic that we're striving towards, right? Which is that human beings are not alien to the world, but integral to it. And someone like Lila June, who's a Dene activist and scholar with settler descent as well, but she says that human beings are meant to be a gift to the land, right? And so often we hear the rhetoric on the environmentalist side that really brushes up against the possibility that humans are almost like a cancer on the world, right? That we need to be extracted, eradicated, or at least confined into our, from making inroads into pristine wilderness. And, the experience of indigenous people, the experience of rural people, the experience of people interested in sustainability is that there's a place for us in the world, but it needs to be much more relational and humble.
Welcome to the Journey of the Universe 10 Years Later podcast. My name is Sam King, and today I'm speaking with Jason Brown. Jason was born and raised in California and studied anthropology as an undergraduate at Brigham Young University. His master's work is in forestry and theology from Yale, where he worked with John Grimm and Mary Evelyn Tucker in the religion and ecology concentration. He completed his PhD in 2017 from the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia. His dissertation focused on the sense of place of Roman Catholic monks in the American West. He teaches courses in ecological humanities as a lecturer at Simon Fraser University and occasionally at Corpus Christi College and Western Washington University. Jason, thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. It's really nice to meet you virtually, and it's good to see my old stomping grounds there in Connecticut.
Yes, and here in New Haven, Connecticut, on the ancestral Quinnipiac land, graced by this beautiful linden tree in the background here. I thought we would start, Jason, by hearing a little bit more about your origin story and what inspired you to become a forester, and how did that vocation morph into becoming a spiritual ecologist?
Okay, cool. That's a lot. I was born in Southern California, so Yorba Linda, which is the birthplace of Richard Nixon, for those of you wondering. And yeah, I was raised in a pretty suburban, urban environment, and then from there decided to study anthropology. I went to university in Utah at Brigham Young. I come from Mormon stock, Mormon roots, and studied anthropology at Brigham Young. And then when I was doing a field study, like a ethnographic field study in Guatemala, it was basically like ethnography, and I was studying how Mayan farmers and foresters interact with the state forestry apparatus, and kind of how they navigate, like an increasingly technical forestry system. I just had this really strong sense that, as I was learning this cultural landscape, because anthropology is all about cultural literacy and understanding the culture behind what we do, I really felt like I wanted to be more literate in the landscape, the forest landscape. So there was something of an epiphany kind of moment in Guatemala where I was like, I think, I'd like to do more with forests, management of forests, understanding of forests. And so, but, I was really rooted pretty strongly in the social sciences. So when I Googled for Master of Forestry programs, the Yale School of Forestry came up, and there was like at least a focus or some kind of concentration with, like Michael Dove, the anthropologist, in social ecology. And that really got my attention because, I had been reading a little bit about social ecology from folks like Murray Bookchin, but so this idea of bringing together kind of social science and forestry really caught my attention. So I enrolled in the School of Forestry. I didn't get in the first year, and then I applied again and got in. And so I packed all my bags and moved to New Haven, having never been there before, and then started that program. And then I realized that John Grimm and Mary Evelyn Tucker were at Yale. And when I was an undergraduate at BYU, on Friday nights, instead of going on dates, I would just sort of wander around the library. Not every Friday, but lots of Friday nights, I would just like wander around the library. And I remember this moment where I came across this series of books called Religions of the World and Ecology. And I was like, that's an amazing thing. I didn't know you could study that. I had always been interested in other religions. And so when I got to Yale and realized that the authors of this series were there, then I immediately enrolled in the joint degree program, the Religion and Ecology program. And that was really nourishing for me because I was, taking classes in, mainline classical Christian theology. And at this time in my life, I was sort of working my way out of the Mormon tradition. I felt very dissatisfied with the spiritual life that for me Mormonism really didn't have to offer. And so as I began to read more and more in this program, reading some of the early church fathers and reading about the desert monks and discovering Thomas Merton, I really started to rediscover Christianity as a religion that has a lot of deep cosmic and ecological dimensions to it. And so even though I spent a little bit of time outside of religion, kind of as a nominal pantheist, as I was leaving the Mormon tradition, the forest really became church for me for a while. And then over the next few years, as I realized that my reading was becoming more and more Catholic, right? Like Thomas Merton, Teilhard de Chardin, Thomas Berry, Ilia Delio, these folks. I was, eventually admitted that I was still a Christian, and I, became Catholic. But throughout that whole process, the forest was very central to that spirituality, right? That very sacramental or incarnational spirituality of being more interested in the book of creation than necessarily the book of scripture. And so that process from, Southern California, Mormonism, and then undergrad anthropology, and then just this sort of unraveling of that Mormon identity just sort of pivoted and really, it was really a hard time actually living at Yale. Like, I wouldn't say I was very happy at Yale. And so, but it was this kind of dark night of the soul. And on the other side of that, was like a lot of grace, right? Like coming into the possibility of faith, and then I actually got work with both of my master's degrees out of Yale. So when after I graduated, I moved back to Salt Lake City, and I started teaching world religion, right, at a community college and then at Utah Valley University. And in the summertime, I was a forester for the U.S. Forest Service. So that was this really cool combination of doing, thinking about religion, and then doing forestry, doing ecology. And I would probably still be doing that right now if the job security had been better in Utah, but it was adjunct, and the seasonal work with the Forest Service is you kind of have to like be willing to travel a lot, move around a lot. And so that's what I ended up doing was a PhD at the University of British Columbia. So, and that's where I am now in British Columbia. I'm teaching in environmental humanities. Well, we don't even have an environmental humanities program, but we have a Department of Humanities, and I teach I teach courses in ecological humanities, which I think we'll get to. But those are the kind of the broad strokes. Is there anything you want to zoom in on there?
I'm really struck by the versatility of your journey, the religious formation you had and, looking to the forest for a sense of both like intellectual and spiritual inspiration, and the ways you've threaded those spheres of your identity together is just really inspiring. And I mean, there's so many things I could ask you about. But you mentioned this context of cosmology as well. And with the Journey of the Universe project, we're really interested in how the broad story of the universe, told in many different ways, is impinging upon human consciousness and inspiring people to pursue various different creative and scholarly directions in their life. And so I'm curious, you mentioned that context of cosmology, and I'm curious how encounters with the universe story and with Journey of the Universe may have influenced your life and work.
Yeah, that's another amazing question. And I think, I was trying to reflect on when my thinking became more cosmic. But definitely Journey of the Universe was a big part of that, because I was just wrapping up uh, my time at Yale in 2011 when the film came out. And, Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm were doing a lot of promotion about with the film. And Brian Swim came to one of our classes. I think I was a TA for Mary Evelyn and John at the time. Brian Swim came, who's the host, obviously, of The Journey. He came to the class. But, during some of the theology training at Yale, I was really starting to get a sense that Christianity was a cosmic religion. And, Mormonism has some really interesting and heterodox views about creation and cosmology as well. And so I think Mormonism kind of primed me for an interest in the cosmos, right? Mormonism is very much an outlier in terms of, Christian orthodoxy, but they had a very, in the 19th century, the speculative theology was very expansive, right? It was like the universe is an infinite place with the possibility of worlds and gods all throughout the cosmos. And so a lot of Mormons are quite cosmic in that sense. And so when I started to read, Augustine and Aquinas, I was getting this sense of a cosmic dimension to Catholicism. But then really, in the ecological theology classes I took, it was, Thomas Berry and Teilhard de Chardin and Ilia Delio, especially, who's I think probably the best interpreter of Teilhard that we have right now. She's a Franciscan sister, theologian, and scientist. I really started to think more about the importance of an evolutionary view of the universe. And, as Sam Mickey says, an anthropocosmic ethic, right? So, in environmental ethics, which I teach occasionally at SFU, we're always pinging back and forth between anthropocentric and ecocentric or biocentric. And I think that kind of binary thinking is pretty unproductive. And so this idea that there may be a place for humans in the cosmos resonates most, I think, with the ecological ethic that we're striving towards, right? Which is that human beings are not alien to the world, but integral to it. And, someone like Lila June, who's a Dene activist and scholar with settler descent as well, but she says that human beings are meant to be a gift to the land, right? And so often we hear the rhetoric on the environmentalist side that really brushes up against the possibility that humans are almost like a cancer on the world, right? That we need to be extracted, eradicated, or at least confined into our, from making inroads into pristine wilderness. And, the experience of indigenous people, the experience of rural people, the experience of people interested in sustainability is that there's a place for us in the world, but it needs to be much more relational and humble. And so my entry point into this journey of the universe was really through the earth, the spiritual ecology, the contemplative ecology that I was trying to practice, but that really connects it to this bigger picture of this evolutionary cosmos, of this, this idea that humans are the kind of conscious growing edge of the universe, and that we have a role to play in that, in the unfolding of the cosmos. Not the central role, not the only role, but definitely a role to play. And I can't remember which Orthodox theologian said this, but something along the lines of human beings are meant to be the priests of creation, right? That we mediate symbols, that we mediate meaning in creation. And that's really powerful to me. And so, Journey was a big turning point for me, reading Thomas Berry and Ilia Delio. And so in 2014, when I was a PhD student at UBC, we put on a conference called Spiritual Ecologies and New Cosmologies, and invited artists and scholars and practitioners from all over the lower mainland of British Columbia to come and speak to this topic. And we had a really good conversation about art and spirituality and, old growth forests and the Salish Sea bioregion. And we had so much energy that we ended up kind of creating a group that planned a conference for the next year. So we created this little Spiritual Ecology Alliance in the lower mainland. And so that's been a big part of the conversation. And lately I've also been interested in the work of people like Nicholas Campion and Richard Tarnas and Becca Tarnas. They're doing stuff with more like archetypal cosmology and even into astrology, which of course I know isn't necessarily part of the paradigm of the journey of the universe, which is rooted in the sort of new cosmology science of Western science. But as you say, there's a lot of different ways of telling the Journey story, right? And I think that's part of some of the criticism that Journey has gotten, was that it privileges a scientific view of cosmogony and cosmology, which I know you're trying to be inclusive of all these different approaches. And so I think that's an interesting way to talk about it, right? Comparative cosmologies, or cultural astrology, cultural astronomy, right? Like, how did ancient peoples find themselves in the cosmos, and Neolithic sites that really oriented people to the cosmos first and foremost, right? As a part of, not just part of their survival strategy or agricultural cycle, but for who they were, right? As a connection between this world or the other world or the cosmos in general. And I think, in the future, we might be moving towards a more enchanted universe story, one that integrates archetypal knowledge, and one that integrates ritual, that marks the solstices and the equinoxes. So I think that's a powerful conversation that's happening on the periphery of this sort of universe story, not just celebrating the fact that the West knows more now than it ever has about the details or the facts of the universe, but that we can rediscover the ways that ancient peoples understood the universe, and really try to participate, right, in this liturgy of the cosmos, this unfolding of the universe.
Powerfully said, Jason. You touched on so many important subjects around cosmology, and I like your idea of cultural cosmologies, or the collective tellings of the universe story, and realizing that this is not just a monolithic domain from Western science, but a conversation that's emerging between, emerging scientific discoveries about an evolutionary cosmos and the inherited religious and indigenous wisdoms from across the planet. and something we're really trying to bring forth with this Journey of the Universe project. And in that spirit, I know you're very interested in this sense of entanglement between our inner and our outer worlds. And you quote Gerard Manley Hopkins on your website, and the idea of an inscape, and sort of mapping the terrain of our earthly topographies into our own psyches, which I think resonates with that idea, the idea of archetypal astrology that you were mentioning. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about that conjunction for you and the Holy Scapes project that you've been developing and writing about this confluence of inner and outer.
Yeah, so Holy Scapes project started right around the same time as the Spiritual Ecologies and New Cosmologies conference that I put on in 2014. And it really was, I was thinking more about this paradigm of spiritual ecology and how it's not, it's not just a warm and fuzzy kind of feeling, right? There's a discipline called political ecology, and it gets taken very seriously in the, it has a whole journal, right? And people talk about the basically a Marxist critique of resource management and the way in which material and political structures influence the environment. So to me, a spiritual ecology is just as weighty potentially academically, right? We're talking about the way in which ideas, ideologies, stories, religion influences, the environment, right? There's a real strong connection between these two. And I remember at UBC, I was TAing a course for a geographer, and geographers, have a reputation to be pretty Marxist in their approach. And he was teaching a political ecology class, and we were having coffee one day, and he admitted to me that his study group in I think it was in Nigeria, that the paradigms of his approach were much better, or the circumstances of his case was much better understood as the influence of ideas and religion and spirituality and ethnic identity, ritual and tradition than they were by the struggle for resources and power, right? So, when I say spiritual ecology, I'm talking about something that's, deeply rooted in culture and even in politics. And so it's not just a starting point for a kind of aesthetic appreciation of the environment, right? It's a phenomenology, and a theory of how we interact, how we find ourselves in the world, and that to me is very powerful, right? We don't just construct meaning in our minds and then project it outwards. The world and our bodies are porous. Our bodies are, made of the stuff of this world. We are star stuff, as Brian Swim says, in the journey. And so to me, this idea of a holy scape is that there's a convergence between inner and outer landscapes. And it's not that the inner landscape is a compartment of, that's unique and separate from, that we look out from this inner landscape out onto, through a window onto the outer landscape. But in a sense that these are folds and foldments, right, of the same fabric. Mm. The inner the inner landscape is a kind of dimension of this outer landscape. So, David Abram's book, The Spell of the Sensuous, spells this out very well in terms of how deeply influenced we are by the world, right? That at the same time that we touch the bark of a tree, we're sensing ourselves as, touchable, as being interactable. And so I think Holy Scapes is trying to get at that from a place of immersion with the world. You could call it a kind of placefulness, right, rather than mindfulness, putting down roots in place, connecting with place. In my dissertation, I looked at the ways in which memory and story and moral lesson attach themselves to place through the lives of these monks that I studied at 4 different monasteries. So our own holyscapes are places that are saturated with our own memories, right? So, if I went to Yale, if you and I were walking around, I could tell you all kinds of stories about things that come up for me in this place, or who I met here, or what happened here. And that's sacred, that entanglement that we have with place and landscape. And I think that is a very strong tactic for combating ecological crises, is not just to bludgeon people with facts or fear, but to, allure them into relationship with places that then become sacred. And then even when these places change, as they inevitably will, or even as we lose species, we're in touch enough to be able to grieve those places and stay connected and defend them, right? And to really to give all of ourselves to the possibility of a livable future.
I'm really struck by this idea of the permeability of the self, and that idea of touching a tree to be touchable from the tree, and sort of dislodging the agency that is so often described to the human mind as something separate from or apart from the fabric of material reality. And yeah, your words reminded me of a poem from Rilke where he writes, what is it if not intensified sky hurled through with the winds of homecoming?
Yeah, I love that. I love
that line, and I think your Holyscapes project is really gesturing toward that. And I appreciate you tracing the limitations of, as you say, bludgeoning people alone with scientific facts, of doom and gloom rhetoric alone in the environmental movement, and trying to encourage a more interior sense of transformation and connectedness to the bioregions we inhabit.
Mm-hmm.
And in that spirit, Jason, I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit more about the course you're teaching in trees, forests, and the human imagination, which is such an interesting interdisciplinary subject, and curious to hear a little bit more about what ideas you're bringing forth in that course.
The trees and forest class is it was my dream class, right? Taking classes at Yale School of Forestry, I felt very on the outside, because I was like, I'm a social scientist doing forestry, and most people were either going to be like career foresters or going to work for the Nature Conservancy, or were on the forest ecology side. And so I kept wanting to hear people say the word beauty in these courses, this on forest, how we would go out into the forest, and it just became very like functional, mechanistic. And I always wanted to, well, this is amazing. This place is beautiful. And so, there's always that sense that I wanted to bring the two things together. And it was actually around 2010 or 2011 that I visited the Mormon Sacred Grove, what Mormons call the Sacred Grove, which for Mormons is this historical place where Joseph Smith Jr., the founder of their religion, claims to have had these visions. And the church has restored and protected this 100 acres or so of forest. And the forester there he's a non-Mormon, but he just loves the place. And so I went up there and spent the afternoon with this guy, and just had this real sense that there was a powerful connection between, trees, forests, and spirituality, religion. And then when I went on the silviculture field trip, which is a trip that the forestry school does every other year, they go to Europe. One of the stops was a Carthusian monastery in Slovenia. and we spent the afternoon at a Carthusian monastery talking about. Well, I think they went there for the liqueurs, but we also spent some time talking to the state foresters, the Slovenian foresters, and that was like, okay, I think I want to do something like this for my PhD. So that was part of the impetus for my dissertation, even though my dissertation ended up focusing more on sense of place. But then, in the back of my mind, I was like, okay, I want to teach a course that talks about trees and forests in the world's religions and the humanities, right? So that's kind of how I approach most of my courses, right? Like, I'm not a strictly, trees and forests in religion, or trees and forests in literature, or trees and forests in mythology kind of course. It kind of blends together the humanities, and then I always zoom it forward into the so-called Anthropocene, right? Like, what are the stories that are being told now, especially around old growth versus plantations, right? So, the forestry paradigm that came out of 19th century and 20th century forestry schools like Yale was basically a kind of progressive public policy. Like, let's manage this resource for the good of the future of humanity. And then we've kind of imported, wildlife management, and now we're talking about carbon, right? But and so when I was taking stand dynamics and other courses at Yale, the idea of old growth was very, it was almost a laughable idea. It was almost like a fairy tale that the environmentalists had made up to make life hard for the foresters and the loggers. And so in my courses, right, I'm very interested in the storylines, the stories that we tell about trees and forests. So, we'll start with indigenous traditions and the really rich animism and personhood of trees and forests, and we move into the pagan, pre-Christian pagans of Europe. So we talk about the Yggdrasil in Norse mythology, the world tree that connects the 9 worlds of Norse mythology. And then we talk about the tree of life in Mesopotamian culture, which was very influential in the Abrahamic traditions. So the tree of life that appears in Genesis and the Quran, and is rooted in this Mesopotamian idea of kingship and divinity. So we talk about that. We talk about the different, creation myths and different trees at the root of stories. The Finnish creation story is quite interesting in the Kalevala, because the hero, Venemoinen, emerges from the ocean as this sort of primordial being, plants all these trees, but then this giant oak tree grows up and blocks out the sun, and he has to cut it down. So, right, like this really interesting tension between this cosmic world tree that's getting in the way of growing crops, right? So he has to cut it down, right? So what's underlying some of the tensions in agrarian mindsets? Or like, the story of Gilgamesh, where he has to go and defeat a demon in the cedar forests of Lebanon, right? He has to go and kill this demon and basically defeat the tutelary deity in order to have access to the timber, to the wood, right? So these myths and stories tell us a lot about the relationship between people and forests, and this eventual kind of objectification of trees and forests into natural resources that we see after the sort of, Grimm's fairy tale era of Europe. As people become more and more urban in Europe, these animistic ways of living become fairy tales, and then it's much easier to really understand the trees and forests as objects rather than subjects, or at least living beings, right? And so we see that gradual transformation of our relationship to trees and forests as being very, very, among indigenous people, it's not like trees and forests have intrinsic value and they're persons and therefore you can't touch them or you can't cut them down. It's actually quite the opposite, right? Not only for Coast Salish people where I'm from, not only is the red cedar tree kin, right? It's a relation, but it's also a very generous giver. It's a tree of life. And so there's a personhood relationship and a utilitarian relationship. And I think that's something that the West has to relearn. How can forests be both sacred and useful? Because we tend to think they have to be one or the other, either sacred, pristine, set aside, or plantation, useful, you know, good forestry like we learn at Yale. And so to me that's something like what I would call a contemplative forestry, right? A forestry that's designed to have a relationship with a place, not just to walk, not just walking through the forest and taking it in as an aesthetic experience, but having an actual relationship with the forest that includes, relying on the forest for our livelihoods. I think that's something the West has a lot to learn about still. And so, the question is this course. That's we explore, how we might do that, and all of the ways that different cultures and traditions have responded. And a lot of it's framed through the lens of a book called Plants as Persons by Matthew Hall. Matthew Hall's a kind of an ecological philosopher. He does a lot with like critical plant studies. So that's a big topic right now, critical plant studies. People like Laura Pastarfi. She did a PhD on phenomenology of trees. She's a really good thinker when it comes to trees and forests and personhood and relationship with trees. And so, yeah, that's kind of the conversation we're having now, right? It's like how we can forge deeper relationships with trees and forests, and not just flip a switch and all of a sudden trees are like they're people now, right? But like really wrestling with the way we've been socialized to imagine trees as part of the background, right, rather than as integral beings to our lives. It's going to be an intergenerational process for a lot of us who have been very steeped in one way of understanding the natural world. And that's there's a lot of cool connections to Journey of the Universe too, right? Like the Yggdrasil is a cosmic tree, right? The trees were very much understood archetypally as connecting the heavens with the earth with the underworld, right? The roots that go underground. So half of the biomass of a tree, at least, is in the dark. And that's a very powerful spiritual archetype. So we talk a bit about that in the course as well, right? Just how symbolic trees are of resurrection, of new life, of the seasons, of longevity, of wisdom, right? You find that in all the sacred texts, whether it's the Bhagavad Gita or the first chapter of Genesis, right? So there's a real cosmic dimension to trees. And something I like to point out is that even the Christmas tree, which was started as a kind of pagan import into Christianity from Germany and then popularized in England. If you think about it, if the North Star is the the star on top of the tree, and then you just imagine the whole sky kind of rotating around the North Star, a Christmas tree is kind of like a cosmic tree, because we decorate it with lights and bulbs, which are kind of planetary, right? So the sky itself, as it revolves around the North Star, is almost like conical in that sense. So a Christmas tree is not just the secular version of the Christian feast day of Christ Mass, but there is a deep kind of winter solstice kind of dimension to the Christmas tree, a solstice tree, you could call it. So I think, there's lots of interesting ways that we could talk about reconnecting with trees and forests in our own lives, but also connecting trees with the wider cosmic story, the universe story.
Such a resonant image, Jason, of seeing the tree as a both as an archetypal representation of the cosmos, but also quite literally turning the light of the sun into energy and biomass, and taking what is above and sequestering that below in root systems. And that's such a powerful both metaphor and literal scientific process that you're illuminating. And I'm just curious to hear briefly, like, how have students responded to this course? And have you do you do outdoor pedagogy? Have you taken students out into forest areas, and how are they receptive to
Yeah.
this kind of method you're bringing forth?
Well, I don't, I wish we could have some students chime in, but from what I'm hearing from them, is that it one is kind of a cure for plant blindness, right? People, and I guess demographically, Simon Fraser University is very diverse, right? So when I teach at Simon Fraser, the percentage of like Anglo descended people is probably closer to 10 to 15%, whereas people from South Asia, Southeast Asia, Punjab is high, very high in the course, and these are people who are descendants of second or third generation immigrants. So most of them born in Canada, but still very diverse in their cultural. They're still bringing and embodying a lot of diverse cultural traditions. And many of them, born in the Lower Mainland, they're like, yeah, we live in a beautiful place. BC is beautiful, but their existence is quite urban. And so when I assign them field journals, which is a weekly assignment where they have to interact in some way with trees, and we basically start with their bedroom, like what is the closest tree to where you sleep, and then we go into their kitchen and we say, what are the tree-based products that are part of your kitchen? Not just the tools and furniture, but like the food. What kinds of ingredients are all derived from trees, or at least woody perennials? And then we go onto their street or outside their apartment buildings. What kinds of trees are there, and have you ever noticed them? So, and then gradually I get them into actual, forest spaces, park spaces, where they have to sit for an hour with one tree and observe what's going on. So that's a real kind of, awakening. A lot of like layers come off, and students come out of the course with a much better appreciation of the fact that they share this place with so many trees, and that trees are everywhere, and they're so, especially our urban forests are so diverse. We have trees from all over the world, even in Vancouver, which is, a temperate climate, trees from all over the world. Whereas, growing up in Southern California, we really had trees from all over the world, because we were mixing tropical, subtropical, and desert trees. So there were trees from Australia and Africa and South America, right? So our urban forests are amazing places to connect with the world, because we have trees from all over. And so that's a big part, right? They really shed some illiteracy. They gain more confidence about identifying tree species. Some of them, are hesitant to talk to trees, but I definitely ask them to try and have a conversation with a tree, which is always kind of a wonderful, tickling, embarrassing experience. And then actually tomorrow we're going out to Stanley Park for the last day of class, because I was teaching downtown this semester, and so we're going to go walk around and gawk at some of the old trees in Stanley Park, which is the big urban park here in Vancouver. And so this semester, the outdoor pedagogy hasn't been as much as I would like. If we were up on the mountain, which Burnaby Mountain is surrounded by forest, we could much more easily go outside. But this semester, I'm teaching it downtown, so we haven't had as much opportunity. But last in the fall, I taught the forest management class for the resource and environmental management program, and we had really, really dry weather all the way into November, and we basically had 80% of the course outside up on Burnaby Mountain. So, and in a lot of their roundtable discussions took place out there and that kind of thing. So the pedagogy is outdoors, in that I assign these field journals every week. But then when we're up on the mountain, I definitely try to get us outside.
It sounds like students are really yearning for these educational opportunities that are engaging multiple senses, as you referenced David Abram earlier, these many forms of intelligence that course through our bodies. And something that Robin Wall Kimmer also writes very poignantly about, right? Moving beyond the cognitive analytical layer of ourselves into relationship, into sensing our kinship with the more
Yeah.
than human world. And Jason, you mentioned a little bit earlier the implications of a relational sensibility to trees and forests, and to engaging trees as persons in a more than human world, with both this aesthetic sensibility and a sense of use value, that we marvel at trees for their beauty, and we also use trees to support our material existence. So how can that sense of trees as persons really catalyze change in forest protection in particular, and the preserving the dignity of indigenous peoples, and moving away from the sort of vast deforestation and the eviction of indigenous communities from ancestral lands that we're seeing across the world?
Mm.
How can this perspective help shift the paradigm?
Yeah, well, a thousand more voices need to chime in on that question, but um, a couple things I would say. One, our binary thinking about trees as either uh, resources or sacred intrinsic value has really created a big, rupture in the global strategy, right? So we have places that are zoned for industrial use, and then we have protected areas. And we need a lot more of that middle ground, which is the sustainable forestry that a lot of foresters take pride in teaching and practicing. But too much of it is steeped in an agricultural paradigm where trees are understood as crop, not as fellow being. And so in many ways, when in many ways that paradigm is continuing to impact indigenous people as these hotspots for biodiversity are being targeted by conservationists as basically no-go zones for human beings. And so indigenous peoples who have lived in those places are increasingly under threat by not just logging and mining and assassination and all of the terrible things that the industrial paradigm has thrown at them, but also being pushed out of places to create protected areas, right? Which, is on one end is an important work. We need to stop the bleeding from this hemorrhage of biodiversity, but we also need to respect the wisdom of indigenous people. So we need to, I think, in one sense, Western descended, settler Euro descended peoples need to get out of the way of indigenous peoples, because the overwhelming majority of indigenous peoples who have control over their lands have, consistently higher biodiversity. There are plenty of indigenous exceptions to that. Some people, indigenous peoples who have decided that generating wealth is more important. That's certainly the case in some places, but the vast majority of indigenous people who are given, recognize where governments recognize their right over their traditional territories, then that's a win-win for people and biodiversity, right? Generally speaking. So getting out of the way of indigenous peoples is a big part of it. In British Columbia, it's happening, probably not fast enough for some people, but it's happening, where as the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, as that becomes institutionalized in Canada and British Columbia, right, the province is negotiating treaties with dozens of indigenous peoples that have very different approaches to the way that they want to manage and restore and take control of their territories. In some cases, it's rights and title, just fee simple, like give the land back. In other cases, it's co-management strategies. In other cases, it's revenue sharing, or in other cases, it's corporate partnerships with forestry corporations. So there's no one size fits all, but all of those things I see as really important, powerful ways to give Indigenous people back what had been conquered and taken from them. Now, when it comes to our own, settler Indigenous approaches, it's going to be tricky because we're very steeped in this paradigm of either or. And so I think the conversation I would like to be part of is how, folks like me can come to a place of both personhood and utility when it comes to forest. And honestly, that's really what I got out of forestry school. I didn't, going in, I thought, old growth protection was full stop, right? Just get out of old growth forests because they're sacred. We shouldn't ever touch them. And there's more value in primary forest than any other forest. But, understanding the ways in which knowledge and technology can enrich and enhance, right? Forest ecosystems and mimic natural disturbances when it's done properly, I think is really powerful. And that speaks to my point earlier that settler people have to learn how to be gifts to the land again, because we're not. We take too much because we're too oriented around the world as an object that we deserve rather than a communion of subjects that we belong to. And so that's the kind of forestry I'd like to be part of, is like, how can we both, take ecosystems seriously, but also include ourselves in those ecosystems, right? Ecosystem-based management has far too often been, management of an ecosystem that assumes humans don't exist. So, and ecosystems have far too often been mechanical and mechanistic and reductionistic. So I think ecosystem sciences is sometimes part of the problem. Industrial forestry chops the world into little pieces that we can sell or consume. The ecosystem sciences, chops the world into primary producers, secondary producers, and decomposers, And so this more kin-based, community-oriented approach should never be appropriated or stolen from Indigenous peoples, but it needs to be rediscovered in our own lineages and traditions. And that's why I think, talking about mythology, story, religion, spirituality, and having conversations like this, is a really important thing for European descended peoples as we figure out how to do this, right? So yeah, that's where I'll leave that. But there's so much more we could say about it. It's just global, there's a global scale. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I really appreciate your breadth of wisdom and the nuance of how complicated these questions are with regard to culture and tradition and how we engage these paradigms of, as you said, industrial ecology and ecosystem sciences, and moving beyond this purely mechanistic, reductive, scientific worldview, but in a way that is culturally salient and centers the sovereignty and voices of Indigenous peoples, as you're saying, is so crucial to finding our way forward. And I'm hoping that, in light of the recent UN Convention on Biological Diversity, there is more attention to the needs and sovereignties of Indigenous peoples in the conservation movement.
Mm-hmm. Seldom do we want either or approaches, right? Never say never, as they say. But it's got to be a lot of both and, right? Indigenous peoples, it does just because a particular group is Indigenous, it doesn't automatically mean that they're going to be ecological saints. But based on the evidence that we have, right, as soon as Indigenous people get control of their territories back, they're taking care of it in a holistic, long-term kind of way for their own reasons. They have good reasons for doing that. So, but we need to integrate the conservation goals, because I don't want any more species to go extinct. I really don't. So it's not like, I'm not shutting down conservation and the strategies. We need that, but definitely we got to respect the peoples who have borne the brunt of ecological disaster over the last 500 years, as colonialism and imperialism expanded and is now hopefully contracting in some ways. So they have a space and an opening, right? And, like we talk a lot about ecological doom and apocalypse, and I'm involved with a lot of conversations about ecological grief at the moment. And indigenous peoples have been grieving in some way or another the cultural legacy of genocide and invasion for 500 years in North America, right? So there's some really divergent timescales here, where settler people are like, "Oh, I'm anxious about climate change." It's like, well, there's a sense that we're living in the dystopia of the indigenous peoples who preceded us. Mm. The dystopia that you're afraid of is the dystopia that you're living, or for many indigenous peoples. And so, the ecological anxiety and grief of settler people is absolutely valid, and we have to talk about it, process it, but it's important to recognize these sort of divergent timescales as they relate to the experience of indigenous historical trauma.
Very well said, Jason. And hopefully that sense of collective grief around climate anxiety can create more empathy and awareness about what indigenous peoples have been undergoing for centuries, as you're saying, and hopefully support some of these movements around land back and co-management of ancestral lands and forests and waterways and these other emerging possibilities you've discussed. But as we come to a close here, Jason, I'm curious if there's any parting message that you would like to share with our Journey of the Universe community.
Yeah, I would just say both and, right? Like and messiness, right? There's no easy answers at this moment, and it's going to be a lot of sitting with discomfort. And settler peoples, I want to get together with other folks and have these conversations about how do we reconnect with our places in a way that honors indigenous people, but also honors our experience and our grief and our willingness to change, right? So just openness, messiness, and both and, I think, is my advice moving forward, right? It's like it's going to be a lot of discernment, a lot of discomfort, right, moving forward.
I'm really grateful, Jason, for you taking the time to speak with us today and to share your abundance of wisdom and to straddle these different areas of knowing that are so often disconnected, especially in contemporary academia. So I have great admiration for the work you're doing, Jason, and I look forward to supporting and amplifying your work however we can in the months and years to come. So thanks so much for joining us again, Jason.
Yeah, it's great to meet you. Hopefully we can connect in person sometime.
I would love that.